Hi everyone, welcome to week 3 of Special Education 671. Our topic this week is the within word pattern stage. This is an important stage. It is the stage at which many kids who struggle with reading are challenged and by which they are challenged. And so as we move through these developmental phases and stages of decoding, know that many of the kids who come to the clinic, many of the kids that perhaps you are or will be working with, have a very difficult time making it through this particular stage, and this is where they kind of get caught up, so to speak. So let's look at where we've been very quickly. We've taken a look at the emergent stage, which typically runs pre-K to early grade 1, where there's a developing relationship between sounds of the language and printed symbols, and kids are developing concept of word. That's kind of the demarcation between emergent and letter name. Letter name, where they have a fully developed concept of word. Remember, finger pointing to words, recognizing space between words is not something that they are challenged by. They begin this stage by using letter names to represent phonemes, and they correctly represent initial and final consonant sounds, and some kids are beginning to master blends and digraphs. All the while, phonemic awareness is continuing to develop and become more fine-grained and differentiated. So today we're going to be looking at that next stage, the within word pattern stage. Note that for typically developing children, this may range from grade 1 to grade 5. Again, for struggling readers, this may range from grade 1 or grade 2 or grade 3 all the way through high school. And in fact, what we're finding with our model demonstration project at Hamilton High School is that this is, again, where many of these kids are struggling. So what are we looking for here? They're representing those nasal sounds. They're beginning to spell long vowel patterns. Typically, they've mastered short vowel patterns. They're moving into R-influenced vowel words, not just CVC words, but longer words, and they read more fluently. Given the framework of Bear et al., we're looking at this pattern stage. We've moved beyond the alphabet stage in terms of the development of English orthography, and we're moving into trying to master the pattern stage. Long vowel spellings, R-influenced vowels, ambiguous vowel combinations and diphthongs, and more complex consonant clusters, both at the beginning of words, the onset, and at the end of words, the coda. And lest we not forget, always developing vocabulary. So how do they describe reading? Well, Bear et al. Suggests that during the within word pattern stage, students move from the full alphabetic phase, representing all the sounds in words, perhaps not quote unquote correctly, but representing all the sounds to a consolidated alphabetic phase, in which they begin to recognize patterns and chunks. We call this in the reading literature paying attention to orthographic regularity. So in other words, we know that kids will recognize O-U-G-H more quickly than U-O-H-G. And in fact, they've done this, they've demonstrated this empirically. If you flash those letters on a screen, it takes individuals a much longer time to identify U-O-H-G than it does to identify O-U-G-H. We recognize T-C-H much more quickly than CHT, and DGE much more quickly than GDE. So this refers to orthographic regularity and being able to recognize chunks of letters as opposed to just individual letters is what contributes both to sight vocabulary and to fluency. So reading in this particular stage, we begin to look at fluency and a sense that transitional readers in this consolidated phase are beginning to read about 60 words per minute. Bear it all caution against making fluency a goal in and of itself and putting too much emphasis on fluency. And I think I certainly would underscore that as well. Fluency we'll talk about throughout the semester as a means to an end, not the end in itself. And as Marianne Wolf says, fluency gives us more time to think. Really, not much else. Although that's important, but to place too much emphasis on fluency at the expense of comprehension, I think is a real error. Kids in this phase move from reading primarily orally to reading silently, which is quicker. They begin to read chapter books and expository texts. And what is absolutely critical at this stage is practice, practice, practice. The one thing we know about reading development is that the more you read, the better you get. And they recommend a minimum of 30 minutes per day. This, of course, again, for struggling readers is a real challenge because it's not something that they enjoy. It's not something that comes easy for them. And so practice becomes a real stumbling block. And that's why motivation becomes critically important. So if we can't get kids reading 30 minutes per day, then it's really important for them to at least listen to fluent text at least 30 minutes per day. And vocabulary. So let's talk a few minutes about vocabulary. We'll of course come back to it again next week when we begin to transition from D to C in that simple view. The last few weeks and this week we're primarily looking at decoding and the development of decoding over time. Next week when we talk about structural analysis and morphology, we'll be moving into comprehension, the meaning. So remember, there's a difference, and my undergraduates struggle with this, between decoding and vocabulary. When we talk about vocabulary, we're talking about the meanings of words, not being able to decode them. So students typically gain approximately 10 to 15 new words per week. And typically developing students do this through their reading primarily, not so much through conversation, which does not typically include academic vocabulary. And they learn it incidentally. They pick it up by reading it in context. But as we just said, kids who struggle to read don't read as much. And one of the fallouts from that is the lack of vocabulary development. So again, just as we'll talk throughout this week about systematic and explicit instruction in decoding, students with disabilities need direct and explicit vocabulary instruction. And let me just show you again, they will get this, as do typically developing children, through being read to, through read-alouds. So that's why read-alouds are so important. Now, this is a book that you might not want to read to an adolescent, but there are books, of course, many books and many passages, short passages, that you can read to adolescents, chapter books that can be read to adolescents and that are on tape. But look at the vocabulary, even in this early elementary trade book. Creaky, creation, disbelief, incredible, and related words colossal and isolated. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with caps for sale. Some words in caps for sale are disturb, ordinary, refreshed, upset, imitate, and satisfied. And a simple book, it's mine. Bickering, defiantly, desperately, recognized, harmony, and selfish. So the place to look for vocabulary is within text. But it can't be on the fly, so to speak. It must be pre-planned and it must be explicit. At the very least, if you're teaching vocabulary, you have to plan which words you're going to teach. You have to know where they're coming up in the text. You have to have ready a kid-friendly definition and examples and non-examples. So what we're finding with some of the work we've been doing out in the field, and that others have been doing out in the field, is that teachers are somewhat reluctant, particularly content area teachers, are somewhat reluctant to pre-plan vocabulary instruction. Maybe it's not something that they've done for a long time, and then they don't know exactly how to teach it. But it is just so critically important that you plan the words, you pick the words, and we'll talk about what kinds of words to pick later on, but you pick these words that you think are high utility words and that you teach them. Again, you've got to you've got to point them out in context. You've got to provide some sort of a definition, because it's probably not good to leave it up to the kids to define the word. And examples and non-examples. We'll come back to this. And then these are words that are high utility words, so you would hope that you would run across multiple exposures to these words in a variety of contexts. They need to record them in some sort of a personal dictionary or glossary, which I do with my undergraduate students here at CSUN, and then review, much like practice in motivational, fun, game-like activities. In this stage, in terms of vocabulary, you can call upon kids' ability to understand homophones, homonyms, and homographs. And there's a paragraph filled with homographs on the Moodle site. Read it silently and see what happens as you read. So what are these things? What are homonyms, homophones, and homographs? And why are they kind of fun? Why do they demand a bit of metalinguistic awareness, something that's important for kids to be developing? Do this exercise. So homonyms, do they have the same sound? Do they have the same spelling? And give some examples, and do the same for homophones and homographs. Okay, so we're back. Homophones are words that sound the same but are spelled differently. Homonyms, words that are spelled the same but have different meanings. And homographs, words that are spelled the same but have different pronunciations. So what does our chart look like? An example of homonyms was the alarmed sign. An example of a homophone was the king that reigned. And homographs are words that have the same spelling but do not have the same sound. So wound and wound and does and does. And the riddles that I showed you are a great way to get kids involved in thinking about vocabulary in a fun way. And riddles and joke books are very, very popular books. And I would encourage you to take advantage of those as you're getting kids to practice their reading. So what does orthographic development look like in this within word pattern stage? Once again, it's divided into early, middle, and late, and we'll take a look at some of those characteristics. Okay, so let's unpack orthographic development in the within word pattern stage. Early, kids have mastered consonants, short vowels, and R-influenced vowels to some extent in CVC words, and they spell some known sight words. They use but confuse silent letters in long vowel patterns, word endings, and they're using but confusing diphthongs and ambiguous vowels. In the middle stage, they've mastered short vowels. They're no longer, remember, they're in effect in the early within word pattern stage, they mastered short vowels. They're no longer using A for short E or E for short I, and they're moving into long vowel patterns. AI, AY, EE, EA. Think about how many there are. But again, confusing vowel patterns and vowel combinations that are more ambiguous, and they're beginning to pay attention to inflectional endings. Remember, inflectional endings are endings that do not change the part of speech of the word. So, trick, tricked, big, bigger, run, runs. These are inflectional endings that kids acquire pretty early on in their language development and use pretty early on and begin to reflect them then in their writing. And in the late within word pattern stage, they're really mastering those long vowel patterns within one syllable words. They're becoming chunks. Are influence vowel patterns in more than CVC words. But there's still, there's still some confusion around ambiguous vowels in complex consonant combinations. You can see why it is difficult for some kids to make it through this particular stage, because they are having to learn so many different patterns, and without that instruction, being very systematic, building one pattern upon another, if it's random and haphazard, they will not learn these difficult patterns to master. So why is this kind of problematic for kids, and why, although it's just one chapter, why can it take years and years for kids to make their way through this stage? It's because there are many more vowel sounds than there are letters to represent them. Vowel sounds are spelled a number of different ways, and we don't just have long and short vowel sounds. We don't just have consonants and consonant clusters, but we have other vowels. Important then for us to understand vowels and vowel patterns. I mentioned before that the undergraduates I teach have some difficulty differentiating clearly between a decoding activity and a vocabulary activity. I also find that my undergraduates, as I call them, have a difficult time with R-controlled vowels. So they may suggest that car, for example, is a CVC word, or fur is a CVC word, when in fact it is an R-controlled. And so it's very important, again, that we know what are long vowels, what are R-influenced vowels, and what are diphthongs and ambiguous vowels, because they develop not lockstep, but somewhat in that order, and we should introduce them somewhat in that order. So take a minute, take those words and sort them into those three categories. If you're not done yet, stop the video and come back when you are. And here is the sort. Long vowels, E-A, A-I, E-E, U-E, and the CVC silent E pattern. R-influenced words and diphthongs or ambiguous vowels, A-U, A-W-O-O, O-U, and O-U is absolutely notorious. And people use this particular example and other examples to talk about how irregular our spelling system is, when in fact, Motes argues that it's more regular than we might think. When we take into consideration that words are spelled depending upon their language of origin, vowels are spelled oftentimes given their position in the word, A-Y at the end of a word, A-I in the middle of a word. They are spelled depending upon the sounds next to them. So whether it's a short I sound or a long I sound depends upon that coda pattern, D, G, E, or G, E. And how vowel sounds are spelled depends upon the meaning of the word. As we talked about the pattern layer, we had to find other ways to represent language in order to take in the new words, in this particular case, from French. So let's just spend a couple of minutes looking at these 5 principles of English spelling that Motes talks about. We have looked at a word's language of origin and history of use as we've looked at the patterns. So we've talked about the soft C and the soft G coming in with the French influence. The hard K sound is the Greek and Latin influence, Greek in particular. Words' meaning and parts of speech can determine their spelling, and Motes uses the example of credible, credit, and incredulous. If we spelled incredulous, she argues, as it sounds, there would be a J there rather than a D. However, we maintain the meeting unit, the cred, and that's helpful for kids as we'll talk about next week in terms of being able to determine meaning from spelling. Finally, speech sounds are spelled with single letters and or combinations of up to 4 letters. And as she says, educators talk about sound symbol correspondences. Linguists talk about phoneme, grapheme correspondences. Grapheme was one of those words in the crossword puzzle from last week. And we have 26 letters to represent 44 phonemes. And graphemes, which represent a phoneme, can be 1 letter, 2 letters, or up to 4 letters, as in way. E-I-G-H, those 4 letters, represents 1 phoneme. And if we count, we have some 250 phonemes that our students have to learn how to use to represent sounds and when to use them. So that's quite an undertaking, and that's what's going on in this stage of orthographic development. However, knowing which grapheme to use sometimes is dictated by the position in a word, and sometimes dictated by conventions of letter sequences and patterns. So this is an interesting one in that English words do not end, think about this, in V or J. And that's because V and J can be easily confused with U and I. So that's why we put an E on the end of these words that have a V, have, give, and love, to keep it the short vowel. We don't end wage in a J. Instead, we end it with this soft G sound, but in order to make the soft G sound, so it's not wag, we put an E on the end. And to maintain the short vowel sound, badge is spelled with D-G-E, otherwise it would be beige. So just some little things about the English orthography that make it actually more predictable than we might think. And this is a classic study that was done in the 1990s by Hanna, Hodges, and Rudolph, in which they argue that really only 4% of words are truly irregular. Nevertheless, this is a hard stage for students to navigate. And I'm going to go through word sorts from Words Their Way. Not so much, in part to show you sort of how sorting, of course, can be very useful as an instructional tool in this stage, but also to kind of go through the progression. Again, the instruction has to be very systematic. Systematic means this is what kids can learn because it's within their zone of proximal development and they have the necessary prerequisite kinds of abilities and understandings. Explicit is what they will learn because it's what you're calling their attention to. So initially, you want to call their attention to the difference between short and long vowel pictures. So you're building on what they already know. They know the short vowel sounds. Then you may want to move to, well, let me go back. These were with pictures, no words involved. Now we transition. So they know the sounds with pictures. Now we transition to words. And they're contrasting short words, short A words, so to speak, and long A words with a particular pattern, which is the CVCE pattern. Next, you may want to add another long A pattern. In this case, it is consonant, vowel, vowel, consonant, where you have AI as well as the silent E, and there's an oddball there. And see if you can find it. You may want to introduce the CVCE pattern across vowels, because that one is really the first pattern that kids learn, and then move on to other long vowel patterns as we do here. Now we've introduced another long A pattern, which is AY. So we've only got long vowel sounds in words CVCE, CVVC, AI, and CVV in this case, which is AY. At the risk of boring you to death, I'm going to go on here because again, what I want to show you is how systematic and how explicit we sometimes have to be, and we definitely have kids who come to the clinic and need this kind of practice. 1 week on AI, 1 week on AY, and then 1 week comparing and contrasting them to CVCE words. Now we're doing picture sort with short E, contrasting long and short vowel sounds. Word sorts, contrasting long and short vowel sounds. In this case, with E, it's CVVC, as in meat. And then again, short vowel, long vowel patterns, EE and EA, and again, find the oddball. We need to go through those for A and I and U. What we'll see is sometimes kids will begin to pick up on the short versus long contrast, and then on the different long vowel pattern contrasts. And so as you move through the vowels, it sometimes can become quicker. But again, systematic and explicit. R controlled vowels in more than CVC words here. Diphthongs. This is where it's getting really pretty tricky. OY, OI, OW, and then again that really troublesome one, OU. Contrasts of soft and hard C and G. Contrasts of complex consonants in the onset, the beginning of the word. And then contrast of complex consonants. This is GE and DGE at the end of a word. So that's kind of the progression. And again, it's, one step at a time, building on what the kids already know. 2 programs I want to introduce you to or revisit. One we talked briefly about last week, which is Touch Phonics, which we have in the clinic. Color coding of the consonants and the vowels. And those vowel combinations, AY, AI, OA, you'll notice as in the EA in the previous slide and in this slide, these 2 vowels are hooked together. So they come as a unit, and color coding in order to make words. Along with the manipulatives are little books This one is Scout the Hound Dog, and its emphasis is OU. So lots of opportunities in these books, which are incredibly simple, and I wouldn't recommend them for anything but just practicing these sounds, but they are good for that. Each one of those sounds comes with its own opportunity to practice in a book. So that's Touch Phonics. And rewards, and we will probably come back to rewards next week. This is multisyllabic word reading strategies, but and it is for adolescents, specifically for adolescents. Very different sort of from Touch Phonics, which is a more elementary program. What it does is it takes multisyllable words, it breaks them up as in a way to teach these vowel combinations. So this lesson, which is actually lesson 1 in this particular book, is focusing on AY, AI, and AU. And it gives you reading word parts for kids to practice. Again, what we're finding at in our high school model demonstration project is that this is really what the kids are having trouble with. In multisyllable words, they can sometimes pull apart the beginning, sometimes pull apart the ending, but it's in the middle where they've got that vowel combination where they're still struggling somewhat with this within word pattern stage that we're really beginning to focus. And so I have a tape which is up. I didn't embed it in the video because I was afraid of uploading it and also working with the trying to transcribe it. But what we've done, and I'm encouraging you to look at the video, is we've combined Touch Phonics with the rewards program and technology. So they're doing this on an iPad. And this is a program that Sally Spencer, in collaboration with our teacher, Lindsay Young, developed. And so I encourage you to look at that. But this is high school kids who have still some struggles with this within word pattern stage, and using a combination really of Touch Phonics, you'll see what I mean, and the rewards program to help them navigate this stage. So this was the last slide last week, and I asked you to take a look at it. Identify the stage of the writing sample to the right. What do we know about the student's word knowledge from his spellings, and what is he using? What is he confusing in this rendition of Chuck likes to eat some chili and some chocolate? So first of all, let me just say that it's hard, and you may have had a hard time identifying sort of what stage this little guy is in. Late letter name alphabetic stage, maybe beginning within word pattern stage, representing all the sounds in the word, definitely using the alphabetic principle. Perhaps has some sight words. Some, to, and are spelled correctly. Using but confusing a particular digraph, and that digraph is CH, and using the letter J to represent CH. So that's one of those, that's a perfectly reasonable substitution. Substituting X for likes. X represents a number of different phonemes actually kind of pulled together. The one thing that is somewhat unusual in this writing sample is the insertion of the N in eat. And so this is a situation where you might want to really watch this child, this youngster, and see if they need some additional work in the area of phonemic awareness. Now, I say it's hard to identify the stage because this is not controlled. In other words, when kids engage in invented spelling, of course they invent their own spellings, and you can make some inferences from their spelling, but in order to really assess in a more systematic way, I'm suggesting you use a spelling inventory. And because you have it, I'm suggesting you use the spelling inventory in Words Their Way. That gives you a look at what specific orthographic conventions they are using. And so your exercise this week is on a separate video, and it is to use score a child's spelling, using the primary, just because it's like the others, but using the primary spelling inventory and words their way. Fill out the feature guide and make some interpretations and decisions about instruction. So the exercise is on the second video for this week, and that's it for today. Thank you.